One's theological system or understanding is much akin to a glasses lens by which we read the text. So what is understood by the words, whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained, varies according to your other theological predispositions. And what this means, practically speaking, is that when faced with a question, your own theological framework is prone to cause you to fill in the blanks without necessarily realizing it. This is a largely unavoidable problem in the most ultimate sense, as we are by nature biased. The only practical difference is in degree. A helpful way to expose these autofill theological inferences is to compare your understanding of the verse's meaning with the text itself. For instance, under the purely impersonal view, whose sins you forgive are forgiven them and whose sins you retained are retained, is taken to actually be saying, when you, my disciples, forgive one another's offenses, those offenses are released and heaven recognizes your forgiveness. But when you refuse to forgive each other, the offense remains held and its effects continue among you. And in the apostolic-only view, it's taken to say, to you, my chosen apostles, I now give a unique temporary authority while you carry out your foundational ministry. Whatever sins you declare forgiven are forgiven in heaven, and whatever sins you declare retained are retained, but this authority ends with your apostolic office. And in the Lutheran or Anglo-Catholic view, it's taken to say, if you announce the forgiveness I have promised in the gospel, then those who receive this word in faith are forgiven. And if you withhold this word of gospel forgiveness from the unrepentant, their sins remain upon them. And in the declarative view, it's taken to say, if you proclaim that God has forgiven the sins of any because they repent and believe in the gospel, then they are forgiven by God. And if you declare that anyone remains in their sins because they reject the gospel, then they remain unforgiven. And finally, in the sacramental absolution view, it's taken to say, whomever you absolve of their sins in my name, their sins are truly forgiven in heaven. And whomever you judge not yet to be reconciled, their sins remain. This thought experiment is tremendously helpful at exposing areas in which we have read our own personal theology into the text rather than acquiring our theology from the text itself. It's helpful to look and see how much you have to alter the text in order to make it fit your theology. So for this next exercise, we'll be looking at how much each view is forced to alter or edit the text percentage-wise. To be fair, it's hard to lock down precise percentages since there's nuances in each group's understanding, so take this next exercise with a grain of salt. And before I even start throwing around rough percentages like 60, 40, or 20% alteration, and so on, let me be clear about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. I'm not pretending to run some kind of scientific, mathematically precise measurement of each interpretation. These numbers are illustrative. They're a way of visualizing how much extra content each view has to smuggle in to make John 20 say what it wants to say. The real question underneath the percentages is this. Does the interpretation change the subject of the sentence? For example, does it quietly shift the apostles into all believers everywhere? Does it change the object? Does forgive sins become let go of your private resentment or announce that God has forgiven? Does it change the type of action? Does a straightforward judicial act, you forgive or you retain, get dissolved into a mere description of preaching or of people's internal states? The more a view has to reassign the subject, shift the object, and redefine the action, the farther it drifts from the simple reading of the sentence on its own terms. The percentages are just my shorthand for that drift. So when I say, this view is 60 to 70% removed from the bare text, what I mean is, this reading requires multiple major rephrases, like new conditions, new subjects, new limits, that you will not find in the actual words Christ speaks here. You're welcome to challenge my estimates. In fact, I encourage you to. The point is not the exact number, but the comparative exercise. Which views require the most theological autofill, and which can be read out of the sentence with the least amount of tinkering? So first off, we have the interpersonal interpretation coming in at around 60 to 70% alteration. In order to hold this view, you've got to change the you from the apostles to mean all believers. And you've got to change the forgive or retain sins to forgive each other's personal offenses or cling to resentments, and detach the verse from the immediate context of the Spirit and mission being given and recast the scene as a general moral exhortation. This is the furthest from the plain reading and narrative setting. It essentially repurposes the sentence into something almost foreign to the text itself. In regards to the apostolic-only or historically limited view, this interpretation has slightly less deviation from the text, coming in around 40 to 50% off. For this view to work, you've got to artificially add time-bound qualifiers which aren't found in the text to make it say things like temporary, unique, during your foundational ministry, or that this ends with your office. And while this view keeps the rough sense of forgiveness and retention of sins, it effectively walls it off to just the first generation alone. The primary deviation is found in this view's insistence of importing a historical limit and non-succession that Jesus does not mention. All in all, to maintain this interpretation, you've got to overlay a strong external framework onto the verse to contain it within the parameters of this view. Next up is the declarative view. This one comes in at around 30 to 40% alteration. Under this view, you've got to rewrite forgive to mean proclaim God has forgiven, and retain to mean declare that someone remains in sin, and tie the whole verse to preaching the gospel rather than any sacramental or juridical act. The if/then structure remains, but the role of the apostles or church is downgraded from doing to merely announcing, and consequently requires a noticeable amount of extra explanation to make the verse line up with the system. Next up is the Lutheran and Anglo-Catholic view. This one's decently close to the original, with only about 20 to 30% alteration needed to make this verse fit perfectly with the interpretation. For this interpretation to work, all you've got to do is shift forgive from a raw effective act to announce the forgiveness promised in the gospel, and insert faith as the condition for that forgiveness to land, so to speak. This view still holds the church's absolution as real, it just softens the direct causal feel of the verbs. So while there is a moderate rephrasing and theological overlay, this view is still reasonably close to the text's surface meaning. And finally, we come to the sacramental absolution view. This is by far the closest to the text itself, coming in at 5 to 10% alteration needed to make it fit this view perfectly, and mostly just clarifies what's already there. Minor tweaks, such as using the term absolve instead of forgive and in heaven made explicit. This view keeps the structure of the text. You forgive, they are forgiven. You retain, they are retained, and adds almost no new concepts. It mostly reads the sentence straight and then builds the theology around it. Now, some might not be a fan of the percentage test since, while helpful for illustrative purposes, it is admittedly a rather arbitrary standard. I would hardly stake my case on the numbers themselves or consider it a definitive way to test the validity of any particular view, but nonetheless, it can certainly help to paint the picture, so to speak, especially when corroborated by other tests.